here's what we know about Jeffrey Epstein as opposed to what we don't know. We know that he knew a lot about Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine, his one-time girlfriends and colleagues, and convicted accomplice's father. Robert Maxwell, as you pointed out, Megyn, was buried, given a hero's burial on the Mount of Olives. It's pretty well documented that Robert Maxwell definitely worked for Israeli intelligence. He also worked, by the way, for other governments. And Jeffrey Epstein knew a great deal about Ghislaine Maxwell's father. What we also know, to your point, is that this guy didn't have a college degree. He winds up teaching at the Dalton School. He then, after tutoring the child of the CEO of Bear Stearns, then an investment bank, winds up being the youngest ever partner there. And he leads Bear Stearns in very, very strange circumstances, in which later, I then go on and report, it turned out he was involved in a sort of insider trading allegations that were going on from the SEC. I'm not explaining it very well. And he sort of fell on his sword, and he remained very, very tight with the people running Bear Stearns for a very long time. And people found that hard to explain. He then moved to Europe for a while. And according to Jeffrey Epstein, who was a complete con artist and master manipulator, he spent a few years hanging out with a British guy called Douglas Leese, who was certainly known to be in the arms business. And according to Jeffrey Epstein himself, he spent a few years going and recovering stolen money from wealthy Europeans in places like the Cayman Islands. He would tell people stories of sort of literally flying into places where people put money offshore and leaving quickly with suitcases of cash on private planes and depositing this cash in Switzerland. So, he himself propagated this myth that he was some sort of James Bond. Meanwhile, his circumstances in New York are humble. He lives in a one-bedroom apartment on East 66th Street in New York. There's no evidence of any sex with underage girls in this time period. This is the 1980s. Fast forward to the 1990s. Things dramatically change for him. First of all, little known piece of data, but an important one, he cooperates with the government in a criminal investigation against a businessman he had worked with very closely, a guy called Steve Hoffenberg, who's now dead, who was convicted of pulling off the biggest Ponzi scheme in American history prior to Bernie Madoff. Steve Hoffenberg wound up going to jail for 20 years. The money from the company, Taz Financial, disappeared. This was in the early 1990s. Jeffrey Epstein flipped on him. And in the 1990s is when you see Jeffrey Epstein suddenly amass a vast amount of money, and he buys the most valuable townhouse in New York. He buys an island. He buys a ranch in New Mexico. And it's at this point in his life that the underage girls first make an appearance. It's also, by the way, this is the decade that Ghislaine Maxwell, her father died, and she became a fixture in his life. It's also in this decade that Leslie Wexner, the richest supporter of Israel in this country, becomes Jeffrey Epstein's benefactor. And it's at this moment, this is the decade when Jeffrey Epstein really immerses himself at Harvard. He becomes, on behalf of Wexner, a major philanthropic donor to all these scientific and cultural and educational institutions. We know that in 1992, he and Ghislaine Maxwell went into the Clinton White House. We also know that it's at this point that he becomes very tight with Ehud Barak, the Israeli former prime minister, and it's at this point that he starts to spend a lot of time with Prince Andrew, and he basically, through Ghislaine Maxwell, acquires the international Rolodex of her late father, which puts him in a very unique place in the world. It puts him at the center of international soft power. The question that I think you want to know, and I think everybody wants to know and wants to get some answers to, is what did he do with that soft power? And what did it ultimately, how did that help him? If it helped him in 2008, get out of the federal charges, get that cushy plea deal, how exactly did that happen? And I think people are also wanting to know, without the money, he could not have committed the sexual crimes. So where did the money come from? And who are the people who propped him up financially? And why have they not been held to account? That, I think, is what people understandably want the answers to. And I don't quite understand.
So you heard it here from Vicky Ward. Julie K. Brown, who's been covering him for years too, said the same thing. Everyone who's really been following this case closely says the same thing. Follow the money. Where did it come from? That alone is worth more disclosure. And someone needs to answer that question. I mean, that's knowable through a forensic accounting of Jeffrey Epstein's documents, of his contacts, of who paid him the money, like where did it come from when it went into the bank accounts? Where did it go out, if at all, by Jeffrey?
Yep.
Like, we've never received the answers on that.
No. And I mean, one thing that struck me, Megyn, when I was sitting through Ghislaine Maxwell's trial were that, I mean, you're a trained lawyer, you know this, that they kept that prosecution so tightly focused on her and the sexual crimes. It was deeply frustrating to sit there and sort of see names of famous wealthy people. Yes, they were on planes, they knew Jeffrey Epstein, but you kept wondering, well, what else did they know? Did they, did they fund Jeffrey Epstein? And by the way, did Jeffrey Epstein then steal from them? Because that was the other thing that Epstein used to say to me back in 2002, was that, one of the reasons he was able to come in and, as he described it, be James Bond for all these wealthy Europeans and go and find their money for them, was they came to him because rich people, when they lose their money, he said, they don't go to the authorities because it's too embarrassing. Well, look how history turned full circle when, after Jeffrey Epstein died, Leslie Wexner, his benefactor, suddenly admitted, because he was sort of caught in a public crosshair, that Jeffrey Epstein had in fact stolen $47 million from him. But it's not something that Leslie Wexner, you'll note, went to the authorities over. And what I did wonder...
Well, that just makes you ask more, like, what does Leslie Wexner have to hide?
Exactly. And I sat there. I mean, when federal prosecutors bring criminal cases, they tend to bring them wanting to win them. And the problem with Jeffrey Epstein's money is it's difficult. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be pursued just because it's difficult. But Jeffrey Epstein definitely knew how to steal from people and how to put money offshore. And it would be difficult for the American feds to trace that money. Does that mean they shouldn't try? I think that's one of the questions that we're now probably asking, whether we know it or not.
Mm-hmm. Let me play you what Alan Dershowitz said, who represented him in getting that sweetheart deal. I don't hold this against Alan. That's what lawyers do. I hold it against the government. It's their job to get the best deal for the people possible. It's their job to put
Right.
bad guys in jail. So, but Alan yesterday said, and I will say Alan's very, very, very close with Israel. It's the subject of his podcast 80% of the
Yeah.
time. So I do take it with a grain of salt, but I think he's an honest broker, generally speaking. Here's what he said.
Then there's the Tucker Carlson allegation, which is the most absurd of all. He worked for the Mossad. He worked for the Jews. He worked for Israel. And don't call me an anti-Semite just because I say he worked for Israel. No. You're just wrong. You're just dead wrong. He didn't work for Israel. Let me tell you how I know. I was his lawyer along with 4 or 5 other lawyers. If he had worked for any intelligence agency, the Mossad, the Shin Bet, the CIA, anything, any intelligence agency, the first person he would tell would be me and the other lawyers and say, hey, get me a better deal. I don't like this deal. I'm going to jail for a year and a half. I have to register as a sex offender. I worked as an intelligence source, so get me a better deal. He didn't tell us that. We asked him everything. We asked him, what information is there conceivably that could help you? We asked him whether people he could testify against. That's what lawyers do.
I'd love to know your reaction to that. I mean, when I watched it, I thought, okay, I'm not sure Epstein would have disclosed that to his defense attorneys. I actually think there'd be a different way of getting to Alex Acosta on it. But what do you think?
Well, I know Alan obviously very well by now. I mean, I think you're right, Megyn, in that Jeffrey Epstein wouldn't have needed to say anything to Alan. Alan would have been more aware than anybody else that Jeffrey Epstein's money, which was in turn paying for this dream team of lawyers, was coming from the richest supporter of Israel in this country. Some things are just out there in plain sight, and you have to be careful. I've never speculated that Jeffrey Epstein was a, quote, Mossad agent. I'm pretty sure he wasn't, in that, he operated at a level where, not on a government payroll. He didn't need to be on anybody's payroll. I mean, people have different roles in quote unquote intelligence. And there are people, and I reported this in Chasing Ghislaine, the podcast series that I made about the sort of the men and the money around Epstein. There are people who the intelligence community call hyperconnectors. And Jeffrey Epstein, particularly actually in the last decade of his life, was unusual in that he was very close to Israeli leadership and the prominent Jewish community in this country and to presidents. But he was also, he had Mohammed bin Salman, now the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, to his house. He knew MBZ. He talked about his close relationship to the leaders of various African dictatorships. He bragged, and you never know whether to believe what Jeffrey Epstein tells you, that he was close to Putin. So somebody like that, which is not, by the way, dissimilar from the kind of networking that Robert Maxwell had, somebody like that is useful, frankly, to everybody.
Since President Trump was sworn in, his administration has made enormous progress at a breakneck pace. But don't forget, while they're moving mountains for the good of the nation, you've got your own personal savings to worry about. And one of the best ways to look after your savings is through diversification, particularly with gold, like from Birch Gold Group. In the past 12 months, the value of gold has increased by 40%. OMG. Central banks continue to bolster demand for gold by buying in record quantities. Global instability and tension is high, and Birch Gold makes owning physical gold extremely easy. Easily convert an existing IRA or 401k into a tax-sheltered IRA in physical gold, or buy some to store in your home safe. Just text MK to the number 989898, and Birch Gold will send you a free info kit on gold. There's no obligation, just useful information. With an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau and tens of thousands of happy customers, take control of your savings today. Text MK to the number 989898. Thanks so much for watching. If you like what you just saw, hit the subscribe button for more clips and full episodes.